Thank you for joining us on the Winning and Selling Podcast. I'm Professor Scott Plum of the Minnesota Sales Institute, and with me is Bill Hellkamp of Reach Development Systems.
There are many issues which cause us to be fearful. Darkness, loud sounds, heights, and closed-in spaces can all cause this feeling. In sales, we might suffer from a fear of rejection or failure or crazy enough success. I doubt if anyone is completely fearless and could have survived past the age of 12. Fear and caution are very good at keeping us alive, but an overabundance of caution can keep us locked into mediocrity. So get out from under your bed and tune into episode 572 of the Winning at Selling podcast as Scott and I welcome David Cornell, founder of Cultivate Courage.
It's going to be a great topic, Bill. For some reason, that intro reminded me of the word thespian. It was very profound Shakespearean introduction. It sounded beautiful.
There you go. All right. Well, we got no book club today, right?
Right. No book club, but we will be doing chapters 4, 5, and 6 in a couple of weeks, and next week.
That's part 3 of How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yes.
All right. Super. So we have a guest today, and that's why we have no book club. So let me introduce our guest, David Cornell. He's a speaker, a coach, a trainer. He helps individuals and organizations overcome their fears by making courageous choices, both personally and professionally, so they can lead more productive, passionate, and engaged lives. He founded Cultivate Courage, LLC, in 2011 to accomplish this mission. His business focuses in 3 areas: speaking, coaching, and training. His powerful presentation, Cultivate Courage, focuses on fear, courage, and change, and how those emotions affect individuals and organizations. Dave, welcome to the Winning at Selling podcast.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, well, fear is a thing that can really stop us from doing what we need to do, but it also can help us. So we got to find that balance, I think.
Yes, you're exactly right. And as Scott said, I loved the introduction. It was very Shakespearean-like, and I think set the table very well for us today. So
thank you.
Well, to be or not to be, let's start by talking about fear. And so where does fear come from, and how does it affect us physically, emotionally?
Well, fear comes from a variety of different places, and I think it's different for each one of us. But first thing that I want to set the table with is there's rational fear. If you and I, and it appears as though from the backgrounds that I see, we're all sitting in our offices or in our home offices, and if the buildings that we are in were to catch on fire, it would be rational for us to get up and get out. It would be rational for us to maybe grab something if we have a moment. Make sure.
Well, not until we finish the podcast. You have to wait.
Right.
Irrational to check to see if there's anybody else in the building that we can help to get out. That's rational fear. It's a real thing and a true thing. The other kind of fear, the fear that I talk about, is irrational fear. And this is the fear that keeps us from becoming who we were created to be. We don't think we're smart enough. We think we're too old or we're too young. We think that we don't have enough experience. And so it's important to recognize the difference between those two. So the focus is on irrational fear. And so when we think about, particularly in the field of selling, and it's not really different from selling to something else, the fear is going to be the same, but it follows us in so many ways. It might be around, we have a fear of making cold calls. I'm an old sales guy. I got 35 years of experience in selling, and I can remember when I first started, cold calling was a tough thing for me to do. Even as I got well into my career, cold calling was still a thing. But I was able to overcome that and work through it. You mentioned in the introduction that there aren't many of us that are fearless. And Bill, that's the thing. That's the key. If we wait to be fearless, we're never going to do anything, because we're always going to find one duck that's out of the row and some reason not to make that call on that potential client. You know, it's not, it's only 8:15. There's not a lot of cars in the parking lot. So maybe I just won't stop there. And I'll come back to them later. So it's rational versus irrational fear. And again, I love talking about this, so I feel like I ramble at times. So I'm going to just
that's okay.
let you ask some other questions or further questions on this piece.
Well, when you start talking about some of the things that you called fear, I'm too old, I'm too young, those sorts of things, remind me of the book, The Magic of Thinking Big. He talks about excuse-itis. I'm sure you've read that book, and
Yes.
he uses those as excuses. So one of the thoughts that comes to me is, do we use fear as an excuse sometimes to not do what we just don't want to do? Or is making excuses like I'm too old or too young, is that really a fear, or is there something else going on there?
Well, it might be anxiety, but anxiety is a type of fear. And so again, it's important to recognize, as you said, excuses. And excuses are, we can blame others, we can look at all kinds of reasons for why we don't do it, but at the core of it, I really believe, is fear. And so we might call it an excuse. And when we talk to our sales manager and say, well, no, I didn't make my quota this month, but here's why. And it's a list of excuses that we often come up with. So excuses, fear, whatever you want to call it, I believe at the core, it's fear.
That's great stuff, Dave. I really agree with that. There's fear in the salesperson when it comes to cold calling, but there's also fear in the sales process. Salespeople are told that people buy emotionally, they justify it intellectually, and sometimes salespeople end up triggering a prospect where the prospect starts to get upset. And this is where I see salespeople really hesitating to proceed with the conversation to be able to leverage that fear to influence. How does a salesperson deal with a situation like that to have the confidence to be able to overcome some of that fear of upsetting the prospect?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind when you mention that, Scott, is objections. And the idea that because they're objecting, they don't like my product, they don't like me, those kinds of things. I remember, again, early in my sales career, somebody said to me, objections are our friends. Because if they are objecting, it means that they are engaged in the process. It means that they have questions and they have problems that they need to have solved. And so recognizing, getting a different mindset on objections and recognizing that this is a good thing that they are objecting. They are telling me what they want and what they need. And now I have an opportunity as a salesperson to solve that problem for them. And in essence, that's what we are as salespeople, is we are problem solvers. And so I think we'll go back to even the fear that people have of being salespeople. Oh, you're a salesperson. Well, you have to overcome that. And the first step in my book, Cultivating Courage, is to acknowledge your fear. You have to name your fear. You have to acknowledge it and say, yeah, this scares me a little bit. But recognize, to go back to your question, Scott, recognize that things like objections, things that scare us and make us go, oh no, they don't want to hear anymore. Those are things that we want, because it means that the person, the party, is engaged and wants to know more about how we can help them.
So true.
So Dave, does our fear level change as we get older? I think as I've gotten into my 60s, I've experienced some differences in my irrational fears, but I wonder if that's also happening in some of those rational fears where I'm just not wanting to do things that I used to be a little bit more courageous to take care of.
I think as we get older, and I'll use myself as an example. I played basketball for many, many years up until I was 62. I'm 68 now. And I gave it up at 62 because I was afraid I was going to get hurt. And, as we get older, recovering from those injuries certainly takes a lot longer. And maybe we don't even fully recover as we get older. So yes, I would agree with you on that, Bill, that we do kind of start to step back into a shell, and we don't do the things that we used to do with maybe a little bit of courage, but now they require more courage, and maybe even wisdom comes in there somewhere as well too. Maybe it's wise for us to not do some of those things that we used to do. And I'll say there is a fine line between courage and stupidity. And we need to figure out where that line is, particularly as we get older.
Yeah, I was up on my roof one day. I only had a one-story house at the time, putting up Christmas lights. And I looked down and I thought, you know what? I'm the major breadwinner for my family, and I don't have, disability insurance. And these Christmas lights just aren't worth it. Right. And that was the last time I ever put up Christmas lights. So at least on top of a roof. So I do think that we make those decisions. important question here. We've talked a lot about fear and that we can be dealing with them. How do we overcome it? What are the tools that you use to help people overcome fear? And what can our listeners do if they've identified their fears and now want to start to deal with them more effectively?
Yeah, I'm gonna just name the 3 points that I talk about when I speak and that I have in my book. First is to name your fear. You have to acknowledge it. Secondly, frame your fear. Begin to see your fear in a different way. To recognize, to go back to use the example of objections, recognize that while that's fearful to get objections, that's also an open door and an opportunity for you. So oftentimes our fears can be opportunities. And then the third step is to claim your courage. Begin to step in it. So it's name your fear, frame your fear, claim your courage, and begin to do courageous things. Begin to take, oftentimes we want the whole path to be laid out for us before we take any steps. Courage is about taking the first step, not even knowing what the second step might be, not even knowing that first step might be successful, but you have to start to do things courageously. I remember speaking to a group of realtors a number of years ago, and a young man who was fairly new in the realty business came up to me and he said, boy, he said, this was so good for me. He said, I have had this block. And again, this is 10, 12 years ago when I had this conversation with this guy. So the numbers are going to be different. But he said, I have this block. If it's a $250,000 house, I turn that over to somebody with more experience, because I'm afraid those people are going to have too many expectations of me. They're going to want more from me, and I'm not experienced enough to really know what I need to do to sell a house that's that expensive. And so he said, this has been really good for me to recognize that I need to courageously step into that and know that I can sell those houses just like I can sell a $150,000 house. It might take a little bit more work. It might take a few more questions and so on. So you have to begin to do courageous things. Have a mentor and a cheerleader in your life. Do you have somebody that you can go to when you're facing a fear, that you can go to and say, hey, here's what I'm facing. What would you do in this situation? What are some ideas that you have that might help me? So if you try to do anything alone, you might have some level of success, but you're not going to be as successful as you would be if you had somebody walking alongside you that has been there before, that it can encourage you and challenge you and push you to places that you may not think that you're able to go.
Okay, there's a lot of people that are managing and leading salespeople. As a sales manager or as a director of sales, are there certain mantras that you've really subscribed to, or certain messages that people that have a tremendous amount of influence in the leadership role? You mentioned mentors for salespeople. What are some of the things that the leaders can really remind the salespeople to keep in mind when they're out there in face-to-face with prospects?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, and we've talked about it already, recognize the role that you are in. You are a problem solver. And it is your role and your job to go in and solve the problems for the prospects that you have. You have to ask, you have to be curious and ask questions in order to find out what the real issue is for the client. And it's important to recognize too, belief in your product. You have to believe that your product is going to make a difference for people, because if you're going in there not believing in your product, you're not going to sell with great courage and great confidence. So belief in your product, and then also recognize that the difference that you can make when you can solve someone's problem and you can make a difference for them as an individual, for them as an organization, what a great win-win situation that is. And so I think I get excited talking about these things, but I'll stop and pause for a moment and see if you have other questions on that.
Well, I want to go back to a statement you made a moment ago, and that was having someone walk along beside you. Scott mentioned your sales manager, sales leadership. Are they always the best person to walk along beside you, or does their need to push you to make more sales sometimes get in their way of really coaching someone? And is an outside coach a better relationship sometimes?
Yeah, I think that's going to depend upon the manager. And as well as the salesperson. It's going to depend on each person in the situation. Some managers, and I had a great one when I was in the sales business. I had a great one that was encouraging, but incredibly challenging as well, but challenging in a very positive way. But I also had some successful people who had been in the business for a long time that I would go to and ask questions. And I remember one of my fears was around closing. I thought that I did really great presentations and was told that I did. But I can remember being and giving presentations and being really fearful of the close. What am as I'm 10 minutes out from the end of my presentation, my mind starts to wander. What am I going to say to close here? What am I going to? And it would take me away from what the closing part of the presentation was before I got to the close. And I visited with a very successful salesperson, a guy that I looked up to, and he said, "Dave, your close should be exactly the same every time." And here's what he told me. He said, "My close every time is based on what we've talked about and what I've shared with you today. Is there any reason why we can't work together on this project?" And boy, what a difference that made for me to have that closing and putting it back in the court of the prospect. Okay, I've solved all your problems. I've showed you how we can solve those problems. Based on this, is there any reason why we can't go forward? And so again, I think it can be either someone who is an experienced salesperson, but our manager can do that for us as well if they know what they're doing as a manager and a leader.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite Bible verses, Dave, is Psalms 118, verse 8, which is better take refuge in the Lord than trust in any man. I think there's a lot of salespeople that struggle with a high need for approval. They want to be liked by the prospect. And when you fear that, you really surrender to that, and you never really overcome it or get the results that you want. Do you have some advice for those folks that are faith-filled in their actions that they can recall or think about or dwell on as they go into a situation with a prospect?
Yeah, I think, Scott, thank you for that question. And I did this morning about 5 minutes before we started the call. I prayed, "Lord, help me to be who you created me to be today." Mm-hmm. And so I think that for those faith filled people, just recognize that God created you for a purpose, and he has put you in this particular position to meet with this particular person. And you may or may not be able to sell them, but go in confidently and courageously, knowing that God is with you wherever you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's profound.
Yeah.
So we have this fearfulness in us. We're trying to overcome it through working with other people and just taking the steps necessary to get it done. But how does this fearfulness affect people around us? What other things can motivate me to overcome this fearfulness? Sometimes I can live with it, but what does it do to the others around us?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. Thank you for that. And one of the things that I learned in this journey, and this journey for me started back in 2010 when I lost my job and was unemployed for 2 or 3 years, and then built this business. But I had a wonderful counselor who helped me to recognize that the fear that I had for much of my life was selfish. And we don't like to think of ourselves as selfish, but if you have been given a gift of being a salesperson, and you have been given the gift of having a wonderful product, but you don't believe in yourself and you don't believe in your product, but you have a product that can make a difference for people, but you don't go in and sell it with confidence, and therefore they're buying from someone else. That's selfish on your part for not believing in yourself, and selfish on your part for not believing in the product that you have and the difference that it can make for others. So sometimes we shy away, we go into our shell, and that's a selfish thing to do if we have something that can make a difference for others. So now let's take a look at the chain of things that are impacted by selling with fear. First of all, you don't solve the problem for your prospect because they don't buy from you, they buy from someone else. You don't generate income for yourself and for your family. You don't generate income for your organization and your company. And the list can go on and on and on. But you have to ask yourself, who pays the price for your fear? So if you are afraid to go in and sell with confidence and sell with courage, and you've got a product that makes a difference in people's lives, that's selfish on your part, because you are retreating into your fear rather than courageously stepping into the opportunity that's been put in front of you.
That's profound stuff, Dave. And I think it's very realistic for a lot of people every single day when they get out of bed as they deal with fear and they have to deal with decisions and they have to be able to have confidence to overcome that. I heard a great quote the other day: if you don't develop it, how can you deliver it? And it seems like preparation is so important when it comes to overcoming fear. What other advice do you have for people when they get into situations that they're uncomfortable, they're stepping outside of their comfort zone, to be able to deal and manage with their fear?
Yeah, I think first of all is to just have that awareness. It's step number one: name your fear, acknowledge it. Okay, I'm a little bit afraid right now, so I need to get curious. I need to start to ask some questions, and depending on the situation, if you're in front of a prospect, you need to begin to ask the questions of the prospect. If it's a situation maybe where you're still sitting in the car and haven't gone in, or maybe sitting by your phone, or however you're preparing to do that prospect call, if you have time, reach out to somebody and share that with them. Again, do this with someone that you trust. Find a trusted mentor that you can reach out to on a regular basis, that is there and willing to help you, and recognize, again, going back to a mentor that I had that fear of making cold calls, and this person told me, they said, Dave, just recognize this. And again, it comes back to rejection. You have to become comfortable with rejection as a salesperson, because we all are going to be rejected. We're all going to get more no's than we're going to get yeses. And so I had someone tell me one time, listen, Dave, I was in school sales. They know that you're coming in. They just don't know that it's you, because they were called on salespeople of all kinds for desks and paper, and you name it, that everything that's in front of you is sold. And so they told me they know that you're coming. They just don't know that it's you. And that was a real comforting thing for me. Oh, they know that I'm coming in today. Well, this is a good thing. So again, I have this feeling that I'm rambling again.
No, it's good.
All good stuff, Dave. All good stuff. Dave, every time we have a guest, I ask one consistent question, and I'm always curious, and I hope that our listeners are just as curious as I am. But what book has had the greatest influence on your personal or professional development?
Well, there's two books that have really had the greatest impact for me over the last 10 years. And one is Daring Greatly by Dr. Brene Brown. Just a powerful, powerful book on fear and courage, and how those two emotions impact us and how we can work through them. The second one is titled If: Trading Your If Only Regrets for God's What If Possibilities by a guy named Mark Batterson. And both of those books are just powerful, powerful books. I've got them both sitting right here, expecting that this question might be asked. And so Daring Greatly and If. Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, and If by Mark Batterson. So
how did those help you? What did you find in those books that was so useful?
Well, they really helped me to understand my fear better. And they really challenged me to begin to do courageous things. And so now when I have opportunities, when things are brought up to me, I view them from a fear-courage lens. And I'll give you an example of that. I work, after we're done with our conversation here today, I'm headed over to a men's transitional house for people coming out of addiction, out of prison, out of rehab. I know nothing about that world, and yet I have been serving there as a mentor for a couple of years, because when somebody asked me about it, I was like, oh no, I don't know anything about that world. But then I look through it through the courage lens. Can I be of help here? Why are you asking me to do this? And again, being curious. And so now it's something that I've done for a couple of years that I didn't think that I had any reason that I could be of any difference to the men and that are there. And so I view things through a fear and courage lens now. And that has made a tremendous difference. And both of those books really focus on that.
Well, what a great morning it's been, spending time with you. Really enjoy it. And I really believe that it's important to help people overcome these fears in order to maximize their lives and enjoy themselves.
Without question. And it's such and this, I don't want to imply through this conversation that we've had that when we do things courageously, that everything is going to work out. We fail when we try things courageously, but that's a win, because we either learn something that didn't work, or we figured out that we've got to do it a different way.
Right.
And so I just want to strongly encourage people, and I'll just say Joshua 1:9 is my favorite Bible verse. Look it up, and that's a verse that carries me through every single day.
Oh, that's great. Dave, we've got a couple of resources. We'll list it on our web page. This is episode 572. And tell us a little bit about this class that you offer. There'll be a discount code and you get $50 off. Tell us briefly about your class that you're offering.
Yeah, it's an online course that I developed for. I often have people, when I have the opportunity to speak to groups, they'll say, well, what do you have? How can I take this? It's such an interesting thing. People say, "Oh, I wish so-and-so would have had the opportunity to hear this."
Oh, yeah.
The person telling me that also needs to hear it. But this is a way for people who maybe hear me on a podcast, or maybe hear me speak somewhere and want to share it with someone else. So I created an online course that goes through the steps that I've talked about: naming your fear, framing your fear, and claiming your courage. And it walks them through. It's got a workbook that goes with it. And again, there's a $50 off coupon code just for those who are listeners to your podcast here. So
Great. Thanks for doing that. We'll have a link to the class, and we'll also have a link to your book, Cultivate Courage. Our golden nugget for today is: we are often more frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from our imagination than from reality, by Seneca. And I thought that was kind of related to our topic today.
So that's so true. And most of our fear, our irrational fear, comes from our imagination. I love that, Scott. Thank you.
And apparently, since Seneca lived in the 00 century, this is nothing new.
Yeah. Right.
Men and women have been dealing with fear and with their own lack of courage for forever.
And their own imagination. I mean, how many things we worry about that never, ever come true?
That's right. That's right.
So again, episode 572, you can find out those notes there.
Everything we talked about today is on our show page, winningatselling.com. So look for it there.
Next week, we're going to be back to the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. We're going to be covering part 3, chapters 4, 5, and 6. And our topic is going to be disc selling, understanding others' criteria, priorities, and values. Please subscribe to this podcast and share it with your colleagues and others on social media.
Go out and get better, one skill at a time.
Joyful selling.